So, ladies and gentlemen, today on Sports File, we're going to take a very interesting look at a player I consider the most important in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1960s. It's Francis William Frank the Big M Mahovlich. Now, born January 10th, 1938, Frank is a former Liberal senator in the Canadian Senate and a retired NHL hockey player. He played on 6 Stanley Cup winning teams, including 4 in Toronto, as inductee in the NHL Hockey Hall of Fame. In 2017, Mahovlich was named one of the 100 greatest players in NHL history. And he's also been an inductee in Toronto, Ontario Sports Hall of Fame, the WHA Hall of Fame, and the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. Now, his younger brother Peter was a great skater, but we're going to talk about the Big M. Now, the son of immigrants from Croatia, Mahovlich was scouted by numerous NHL hockey teams while playing for the Schumacher Lions of the Northern Ontario Hockey Association. When he signed with Toronto Maple Leafs, they sent him to one of their OHA affiliates in Ontario, the Toronto St. Mike's Majors. He played there while attending St. Michael's College school from 54 to 57. And at St. Mike's, he was guided by the great Joe Primo, who Mahovlich would later called the best coach he ever had. And Mahovlich received the Red Tilson Trophy as a top player of the OHA for the 56-57 season, which he scored at a goal-a-game play at pace with 52 counters in 49 games. Now, born in Timmins, Ontario, Mahovlich was known for his size and grit, 6'1", 255 pounds, a natural left winger, and he basically, when he came in the NHL, he came with great fanfare and proved it. In 57-58, he scored 20 goals and eventually won the Calder Memorial Trophy as Rookie of the Year. It was a tough season for the last place Leafs that year, but Mahovlich made the best of his occasion. And back then, 20 goals in the NHL was worth like 40 now. And this is where the problem came. That year, Punch Imlach was hired to run the Leafs and soon became head coach and general manager. And as a lot of people know, that Punch Imlach and Frank Mahovlich eventually had a bad relationship, which led to some severe problems for Mahovlich's mental state, but we'll get into that in a few seconds. Now, in the 60-61 season, Mahovlich was put on a great line with Hall of Famer Red Kelly and Bob Nevin. Now, the tree immediately clicked and were the squad's top 3 scorers that year, led by Mahovlich's then record 48 goals, which was the most by a Leaf that would stand for 21 years. The next year, the Leafs went on the first of a three-peat Stanley Cup run, and he led the team in goals in all 3 seasons. Now, Mahovlich, who was known for his big, heavy slap shot, these big bumps, he was one of the original power forwards, a la Cam Neely, with a little bit of Eric Lindros's style around the net. He was hard to stop in any situation, and the opposing teams, especially the Habs, had a hard time containing Mahovlich. Now, where the downturn in Mahovlich's career on the ice began, like Mahovlich and Imlach never really got along very well, and the relationship deteriorated over the next few seasons. And because Toronto was a money team at the time, they were watching every penny. When Mahovlich's contract became up for renewal in '62, he felt the Leafs were giving him a low-ball offer, and eventually walked out the team during training camp. And according to published reports in Toronto Star, they were calling it a blue gold war situation between Imlach and Mahovlich. And at the time, the Toronto hockey press was really taking sides with Imlach and the management, and this led to a very bizarre situation a few weeks later. We're at the National Hockey League All-Star Game, which at the time was played at the beginning of the season, being held in Toronto. There was a reception with numerous team executives in the days before. Now, when the Chicago Blackhawks owner, James Norris, found out that Mahovlich was disgruntled by being in Toronto, he offered the Leafs $1 million neat for Mahovlich. Now, according to Norris, he believed he had an agreement with Harold Ballard, the crackback owner of the Leafs, or majority owner, and put down a $1,000 deposit with the balance to to be delivered by check the next day. Now, the next day, in a about face, the Leafs gave Mahovlich the money was being asked for and told the Blackhawks that their agreement, or apparent agreement, had been a misunderstanding. Well, it wasn't. The Leafs did return the $1,000 deposit. The Blackhawks then accused the Leafs of reneging on the deal, and Conn Smythe, who was a minority shareholder in the Leafs, was adamant that the deal should be rejected. But if this would occur in the modern era, Chicago would have probably either got Mahovlich or got compensation. But the league was renegade at the time because the NHL Players Association, the bargain agreement and all that was more like servitude. Most players were signed to a team when they were 12, 13 years old, and they owned their rights. There was not the free agency later on we see on Major League Baseball, like the Curt Flood years. Now, because of this and other factors, the fans at Maple Leaf Gardens, for some reason, were always down on Mahovlich, or majority were. They would boo him at home games. Like the 4 cups he won throughout the years weren't enough. Now, Imlock would deliberately mispronounce Mahovlich's name, and he also became a constant critic of him in the media, and eventually this led to Mahovlich being admitted to the Toronto General Hospital in November of '64, suffering from what is later been called like mental burnout and constant fatigue of trying to deal with the pressures of playing in Toronto. He was eventually diagnosed with acute depression. Now, even though the fans, support him on his comeback, he still had issues, but he returned to the lineup a month later and was still able to lead the Leafs in scoring in 64-65 and did the same in 65-66. Now, the Leafs' last great era came to an end the next year when he won the Cup against Montreal in 6 games in 66-67, but Mahovlich ended up having his lowest scoring season in 7 years. Now, in 67-68, the depression issues came back, and he was admitted to the hospital a second time. And the Toronto Star, who were always ragging on Frank Mahovlich, said to writer Milton L. that Mahovlich was a whiner and he was considered a sensitive, easily bruised individual. Well, here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. If you play in Toronto, the media can be on your back. And Mahovlich was the type of guy who was pretty well saying, what else do I have to do? And, he was had very little support from the true media in Canada like you see now. I don't think anybody from TSN or Sportsnet or the major papers would be ragging on Austin Matthews and different players for being, too sensitive. He produced for Toronto. The 4 cups were there. I mean, what else did he could have done? Now, Toronto eventually, either Mahovlich divorced him or Toronto divorced Mahovlich. He was traded to Detroit Red Wings along with Pete Stemkowski, Gary Unger, and the rights of Carl Brewer for Normie Ullman, Paul Henderson, Floyd Smith, and Doug Barry. Now, nice to see Henderson and Ullman coming back to Toronto, who were great players, and it was good value for Mahovlich. But this was akin to the Gretzky or the Lindros trade years later, where there would be not enough compensation because Mahovlich was the heart and soul of the Leafs, who could score the goals and keep the team in. Now, he did have a strong first few years with the Red Wings because he was put on the line with Gordie Howe and the great playmaker Alex Delvecchio, and he set his own personal record for goals this season with 49 in his first full campaign with Detroit, and it made him reunited actually with his younger brother Peter, who was playing part-time with Detroit in between the farm team and the big team. Now, the next big drama in Mahovlich's career came in 70-71 when general manager Sid Abel was trying to get rid of coach Ned Harkness, and he got overruled by team owner Bruce Norris, and eventually Sid Abel was forced out in Detroit and Harkness took over, and as soon as Harkness took over, he had a grudge against Mahovlich and eventually did a few machinations to get him traded to the Montreal Canadiens of all teams for Mickey Redmond, Guy Charon, and Bill Collins. Now, he was reunited with Peter in Montreal, and it was a perfect fit, playing with his brother, playing on lines with Cornway and Jacques Lemaire, different people, and especially in the 71 playoff against Boston. He became another level to his stardom with Montreal. He spent 3.5 seasons in Montreal, eventually scoring his 500 career goal with the Habs. And he played on the Habs Stanley Cup winning teams of 71 and 73. And he had really, really good point totals. 71, 72, he had 96. 72, 73, he had 93. And hit a new level in his career. Now, here's what another change in Mahovlich's career came about. Because he always wanted to play for Team Canada against the Russians. And when the 1972 Summit Series roster was being selected, Peter was a no-brainer. But like most Team Canada players that year, including Parise, Esposito, Bergman, Clark, he lost his friggin' mind. Like Frank Mahovlich playing against the Russians, being a Croatian immigrant, said to his anti-communist fever to such a level, he was paranoid in Canada, he was paranoid in Russia. The famous incident where he thought his room was being bugged. He unscrewed a chandelier thinking it was a bug, and the $10,000 chandelier fell to the foyer below. He was completely paranoid, and it kind of hurt his game against the Russians, but Team Canada couldn't have won the 72 Summit Series in 8 games and against the Russians without Frank Mahovlich. Now, he did leave the NHL for a second life in Toronto. He played Toronto Toros and Birmingham Bulls for a few seasons. Also played the 74 Summit with Team Canada against the Russians, the WHA Team International or Team Canada against the Russians. Had a good series, but at the time his career was starting to mellow out. He enjoyed the time in Toronto and Birmingham, despite the fact he put him on a line and with the Bulls with Frank Beaton and one of the Hansen brothers, Dave Hansen. According to coach John Brophy, the media was asking, what was going wrong with your point total. Well, I'm playing on a line not with Howe and Mahovlich, but with two goons. So even though he attempted an NHL comeback with Detroit Red Wings in 79, it was unsuccessful, and he formally retired on October 7th, 1979. But points and goals totals were just amazing in the NHL. In 1,181 games, he had 533 goals, 570 assists for 1,103 points, and 51 goals, 67 assists, and 118 points in the NHL playoffs, again with those 6 cups. And his best, of course, playoffs was in 1971, where he scored 14 goals for Montreal in 27 points in 20 games, especially strong in the Boston series, because in the 5-1 to 7-5 comeback win in Game 2, he was a key catalyst in that victory. Now, his legendary totals also include, now get this, besides winning Calder in 58, he made every All-Star team in the NHL from 1959 to 1974, except for 1966. He was the NHL first All-Star team in 61, 63, and 73, second All-Star team in 62, 64, 65, 66, 69, 70, Stanley Cup champs 62 to 64, 67, 71, and 73. In the Hockey Hall of Fame induction 81, Canadian Sports Hall of Fame in 1990, Order of Canada. He was ranked number 26 on the Hockey News list of the 100 greatest players in 1997. Member of the WHA Hall of Fame inductee in 2010. He's number 27, has been retired with Darryl Sittler, the famous number 27. And, his legacy is that where he overcome personal demons, he overcame disrespect from management, disrespect from his coaches, to be a top 5 Toronto Maple Leaf. If he stayed with Toronto, would he won any cups in the late 60s or the 70s? Probably not. It was time for him to go because Toronto, with expansion, suffered a lot more than most teams in relation to losing players. But I think Peter Mahovlich, for what he did for the NHL, he's kind of unofficial creation of the power forward. He would go to the net. He could be the big slap shot, the big power play. Wasn't scared to take the hit. A great playmaker, a good transition player. There's only 25 players in the history of the NHL that were better than him, and is marginal better. Imagine if he was playing with Wayne Gretzky or Messier or Curry or Guy Lafleur. Well, you did play with Guy Lafleur, actually. But, on the same regular line. If you played with Yvon Cornway more often, how many more goals would he have scored? Could have scored 700-800. But like I said, the mental games that Toronto management played with him almost killed a couple of years of his career, his production. But like I said, the mental fatigue or the mental depression that's talked about among sports athletes now, he was the person that said, listen, I need help. And when players do need help, they point to Frank Mahovlich and said, if you don't get me the help I need, I'm going to turn to another Frank Mahovlich. There's no reason you should be on your own. If you're suffering depression or self-defeatism, there's always options out there. So Frank Mahovlich, thank you for being such a talented player, for being an inspiration to a lot of people, for being part of Team Canada, for doing so much for hockey. And you are definitely, when the word legend comes in, people think of the big M, Frank Mahovlich. You're a legend of the hockey. So on this, foggy Monday in New Brunswick, where we wish everybody good luck with the Floods, just remember, all the Toronto Maple Leaf fans, you don't have to worry about winning another cup because Frank has won enough for you. So if that's any console. Have a good day. Bye.